History. It's a strange thing. Not all the time does it go as expected. We mean, just thinking about very recent history, it was expected that one country was going to quickly steamroll another country into submission, and then continue its more or less uncontested imperial ambitions all over Eastern Europe. Now it's been over a year and a half, and the conflict is still going on, said former superpower, now a pariah state that's getting their asses pushed back by a country of grain farmers, with some foreign support and a small fleet of tank-towing tractors. Indeed, sometimes things that we consider unrealistic are what make history. Sometimes the most unexpected thing actually comes to pass, and it changes the world. Sometimes the most ridiculous fears of the most paranoid and unreasonable individuals are completely founded. And since that is what this channel is sort of supposed to be about, we're going to start off with one of our personal favorite scenarios, what we have lovingly come to call the Meiji Caliphate. This is Abdul Hamid II. He was the last absolute ruler of the Ottoman Empire and Caliph of Islam at the time. He was also a knight of many different nations, including but not limited to the Grand Cordon of the Empire of Japan's Order of the Chrysanthemum, as granted it to him by Emperor Meiji. This is the highest order of Japan that an individual can attain, and at the time, the highest grade of that order. He composed several opera pieces, and was a carpenter who made some furniture that still exists to this day. And of course, he's traditionally referred to as one of the driving factors behind the Pan-Islamist movement, which historically was seen as not super great for a variety of European countries for a variety of reasons. And he inspired the formation of the Young Turks to depose him and overthrow absolute monarchy. No, not those Young Turks, the originals. Yeah, those ones. Excellent, back on track. So, little known fact, this guy was allegedly terrified that Emperor Meiji of Japan, the temporal leader, basically the Pope of Shintoism, was going to convert to Islam and then name himself Caliph. We're gonna say that again. Abdul Hamid II, last absolute ruler of the Ottoman Empire, lost sleep over the hilarious idea that the Pope of Shinto was going to quit the Japanese ethno-religion that still exists today as a primary dominant religion of the country, to this day, convert to Islam, and then take his job as Pope of Islam. Now, of course, this is ridiculous. This would be the functional equivalent of Pope Francis one day converting to Buddhism and naming himself the next incarnation of the Dalai Lama. That's not even a joke. That would be a functionally equivalent scenario to this. But it was allegedly a real thing that the Sultan legitimately feared. So much so that it's still talked about here and there to this day. We brought it up to the alternate historian once, but, the poll that he set up wasn't biting, so we're gonna do it instead as the very first episode on our very own alternate history channel, Unreal History. A channel of alternate histories that are not technically impossible, but are also not very likely. First and foremost, some historical context. For those of you who are rightfully thinking that Japan and the Ottomans are a bit far away to be coming to blows over religion, you may be surprised to know that the Ottomans and the Japanese were actually pretty darn good friends at the time. Pan-Asianism had started becoming a thing, and the Ottomans always tried to style themselves as not Europeans, but rather as coming rightfully from Asia Minor and Central Asia. Ottomans being Asians too brought a lot of support to Meiji and Tokichi Tarui, at the least in name. As mentioned earlier, Abdul Hamid II actually held the highest grade in the highest knightly order that Japan is home to. At the time, the Ottomans were even sort of suffering through a bit of early modern age weebery, the press obsessed with Japanese advancement into the modern era. Japan was, at the time, sort of also pushing for Russo-Japanese conflict, which would come to pass in the early 1900s, and Russia was the traditional enemy of the Ottomans, so there's a lot of good reason why the Ottomans and the Japanese were getting along together at the time. Moreover, Islam extended all the way to Southeast Asia and Austronesia, so it was closer to Japan's doorstep than we like to think. We could probably go on all day about it, but it's not really what this video is about, so let's move on. Very long story short, Japan and the Ottomans were super chummy together at the time. Emperor Meiji would send Yamato princes off to shower Abdul with gifts. The Ottomans in turn would publicly shower Japan with admiration for modernizing and embracing new scientific ideals without sacrificing their cultural standards and homogenizing into the rest of the global sphere. It was a good time for both parties, at least at the diplomacy tables. Yay! As we know, Meiji never did name himself Caliph of Islam despite popular rumors, and time went on as history decrees. But what if, in an alternate timeline, Meiji pulled the ultimate act of international trollsmanship and did exactly what Abdul Hamid II feared? What if, just to fuck with him, Emperor Meiji of Japan took Sultan Abdul Hamid II's job? To start, we have to take this from the beginning. Why the hell would Meiji do this, and how would he expect it to work? Less than 1% of Japan, even today, is even Christian, and Islam is practically unheard of. At the time, this number would have been even smaller. Shintoism and Buddhism, to make it even worse, could not be more different from Islam. Islam is a monotheistic religion with a central focus on the Abrahamic Big G God. They rather explicitly worship the same deity as Christians and Jews do, being people of the book, but believe that the Bible has by and large been corrupted by the writings of man, and that Jesus was, well, certainly a very holy dude, not a prophet of Allah or the Messiah. Because, that's Muhammad. Polytheistic faith is not okay, and indeed, the acknowledgement of other deities, just as in Christianity, is considered sinful and wrong, perhaps even idolatrous. Shinto, in stark contrast, is founded on the belief that kami, deity-like spirits, are present all around us and live in particularly impressive landforms, constructs, buildings, places, etc. And Buddhism, the other big-time religion in Japan, has largely syncretized with Shinto since its arrival in Japan and is otherwise an internalized descendant of Hinduism, seeking personal enlightenment through the denial of the material world and the impermanence of life. These, all three of them, are extremely simplified explanations of these religions, and for what should be very obvious reasons, we're not going to delve too deeply into the nuance of each of these religions, regardless of how much we might or might not know about them. This is not a video about comparing religions, it's one about smashing them together. Because that is the only way that Meiji would foreseeably be able to do this. You see, Islam might not have other gods, but kami aren't really gods at all, are they? More like really powerful fancy spirits. And Islam does have a few branches of spirits and weird monsters and stuff that kami could easily slide into. They're called jinn. Sorta like that. Kinda. Jinn are actually from pre-Islam, but Islam pretty much gobbled them up when it came around, and now they just have tons of them all up in that religion. Islam acknowledged that other spirits from other religions might be able to be incorporated into it upon its founding, and that is precisely how we get tons of these weird spirits. Some jinn are good, some jinn are bad, some are believers of Allah, some aren't, some protect you, and some turn into snakes to bite you for being bad, and some wait in your bathroom and fuck with you if you don't pray while taking a shit. No, we're not joking, that's a thing. So there's actually quite the diversity of jinn in Islam, just as there's quite a diversity of kami in Shinto. So rest assured that this is absolutely not what you want to think it is. Kami and Japanese folklore has a ton of different spirits and monsters, called yokai, and they even have giant festivals dedicated to spirits and sending them on their way. In a very strange, roundabout way, kami and yokai can absolutely be likened to jinn and other Islamic spirits. Seeing the potential chance to not lose his life in a religious coup, not only does Meiji find a way to convert to Islam, but he finds a way to convert Shinto into Islam. You see, Shinto revolves around a central sun deity named Amaterasu. The mythical first emperor of Japan was allegedly descended directly from her and came from the heavens to rule over the world. Meiji, seeing an opportunity, syncretizes this with Islam. You see, in Meiji's new Japanese version of Islam, Amaterasu still exists. She's just Allah's wife. And the first emperor of Japan is therefore descended from Allah and Amaterasu's coupling. Meiji spins this strange new syncretism that Allah, trying to settle the lands of Earth, sent Emperor Jimmu, the first mythical emperor of Japan, down, but then Jimmu got lost along the way, and millennia wore on and things were forgotten, but now, thousands of years later, Meiji himself has rediscovered his holy ancestors and embraced the glorious faith of Islam. And being the direct descendant of Allah, the position of Caliph is now no longer in question between major sects of Islam, and the schism may be neatly mended. For the Caliph shall neither be descended from Muhammad nor those of his students, but rather he who carries the blood of Allah in his very veins. Many kami and yokai and other spirits of Shinto are just extensions of Allah's will, jinn and other such invisible things, myriad and fascinating. Praise Allah and all of his creation. Naturally, this would not go well. The Ottoman Sultan has lost so much sleep over this potential event, and despite the unlikeliness of it all, that rascally Emperor Meiji found a way to challenge his authority just as the Ottoman Empire was at its weakest. After all, it's now 1900, and Abdul Hamid II has just ordered the Sulu Sultanate to let America take the Philippines, telling them to stand down and not resist. He has also given in to Kaiser Wilhelm II's demands of aiding the Boxer Rebellion in China. Already he'd gotten so snuggly with the Germans that he'd hosted the Kaiser twice in the Ottoman capital. His rule was weak, and both Pan-Islamism and Pan-Asianism were failing under his watch. But Abdul was also an aggressive sort of man from everything we can tell from research. He won some wars and he lost some wars, but most importantly, despite styling himself as a sort of liberal-minded leader early on, his reign was largely focused on consolidating power into his own hand, lowering the amount of officials that could question him, and censoring press alongside tightening control over all information transfer in general. Even when others recommended he relax his authoritarian measures, he staunchly opposed the idea of a constitutional government. Meanwhile, Japan was a growing economic powerhouse that had adopted a constitution some 10 years before based on British and German models. It had good relations with Western powers without allowing itself to be bullied by them, and it was truly coming to the fore as a modernized nation with a growing productive military still hot and riding high off the First Sino-Japanese War. It's difficult to say how much power was actually in the hands of Meiji himself during this time, but suffice to say that this particular decision, this choice was his. To become a Muslim. How would the people of Japan react to what amounts to their Pope converting to a distant religion from a desert land on the other side of the world? Well, probably not great, but also probably not super horrible. Meiji's administration was strong at the time, and Meiji himself would go on to lead Japan to become one of the world's great powers in the next decade, and already Japan was becoming a well-known nation that was smiled upon by other great powers. Meiji had considerably reformed the army and navy to make it a respectable military force, and there was no stopping that until, well, World War II. And yet, something tells us this wouldn't stop Abdul Hamid II from declaring war on the Japanese Empire, and Meiji, we imagine, trolled around in his palace with a great big grin on his face. World wars are a funny thing, aren't they? One day, Archduke Franz Ferdinand is just riding around a city he has no experience with, and his driver, equally inexperienced with the roads, happens to drive in front of a dude enjoying a sandwich, who happened to have missed his shot in killing old Ferdinando just moments beforehand. And so one sandwich changed the world, no matter how unlikely. Well, in this timeline, one Grand Master of Trollery in the form of Emperor Meiji of the Japanese Empire started it all. You see, Japan was emerging as a world power at the time, but it wasn't really that related to the other powers. Meiji had worked hard to reform things and solidified Japan as a regional power with the First Sino-Japanese War, but they still had to get over all that isolation. Furthermore, many of their incoming ships to form the backbone of their newly modernized navy were still being built at the time in Britain and America. However, it isn't entirely bad for Meiji. At the time, the Ottoman military had a bit of a mixed record. The Japanese military, in stark contrast, was strong and getting stronger, and relations with Britain and America were both good. In the case of Britain, very good. And relations between Britain and the Ottomans, Not very good. Bad, even. The Ottoman Empire, in the same year that the Japanese won the Sino-Japanese War and established themselves as a regional power, committed brutal genocidal massacres on their own population after the Sassoon Rebellion, a motion that all of the great powers at the time, but especially Britain, whose prime minister called Hamid the Great Criminal and the Red Sultan, strongly condemned. Hamid would go on to commit even more genocidal massacres, killing hundreds of thousands of Armenians, seemingly in an attempt to simply clear them out of Armenia, while tens of thousands more were forced to convert to Islam to avoid execution. Germany, France, Russia, and Britain all sent investigators out to find out exactly how much destruction was wrought on the Armenian people, but ultimately, it is still unknown to this day, with the highest estimates reaching somewhere around 300,000. And that was just one of the many rebellions that had needed quashing in the last 2 decades. Now, in an attempt to punish a distant power for trying to steal clout from them and rob the Caliph of his religious position of authority, the sick man of Europe was going to war despite all of the nonsense going on within their own borders. But, of course, that couldn't be it, could it? It can't be an isolated match between equals over a distance that great and in a world that ready to descend into complete and total madness. You see, despite the fact that they'd had recent conflicts, Russia was actually for the Ottoman massacres, their foreign minister being hilariously anti-Armenian, but the rest of Europe, even close friend Germany, were not sold on the matter. So, considering that the British and the Dutch control most of the area from Japan to the Ottoman Empire, well, it's not unreasonable to consider that Britain, not even needing to dedicate a respectable portion of their military, might well just allow Japanese naval assets to sail through the Indian Ocean to gain access to the Red Sea. British Malaya, the British Raj, Oman, and Somaliland are all under British control at this time, and if they want to let the Japan roll through, then, by all means, it is something special. And Britain doesn't like the Ottomans in general, so this is potentially likely. Franco-Ottoman relations were good several centuries ago, but the last 100 years between France and the Ottomans has been progressively more complex after that whole Napoleonic business, and France would side against the Ottomans in World War II in World War I in our timeline, so it's not too much of a stretch that France would respond to Abdul Hamid's power-mad move to fight Japan as a sign that the winds of change are beginning to blow, and that they need to get on the right side of history. That being said, they were financiers in the Deutsche Bank Commission for a railway to Baghdad, so let's assume that France doesn't take too active a role in the war, at least at first. Ooh, and France and Russia presently have a military alliance. France's hands are tied. They have to join the side of the Russians, whomsoever the Russians choose to support. That brings us to Germany, who was good friends with the Ottomans at the time, and ultimately were going to make a railroad from Berlin to Baghdad. Construction hadn't started yet, but already the Germans have been determined to be the builders. Most of Europe won't pay attention to this development, but suffice to say it has put the Germans in the Ottoman pocket. If their railway is a success, it will undermine British authority in the Persian Gulf, which Britain hates and Germany wants. Russia, of course, would not like this situation. They will, awkwardly, take the Ottoman side in all of this, having shown support for the Hamidian massacres and setting aside their former conflicts and struggle against each other for the sake of mutual power-grabbing, and as a check to Japan's public desire to encroach on the Russian mainland, which has already been talked about. What's more, both Ottomans and Russia want more, and Austria is in their way. Play their cards right, and they can eliminate an old faction and get more land at the same time as taking care of the Japanese threat. Austria, Hungary, and Italy are in a weird situation. You see, on December of 1900, which wouldn't happen yet in this scenario, Austria, Hungary, Italy, and Germany sign an agreement that they would stick together if France or Russia were to attack any of them. But now, Germany is siding with Russia, and France is siding with them, and Austria-Hungary looks mighty tasty to the Ottomans and Russians. Furthermore, that treaty hasn't even been made and signed yet, as mentioned earlier. There's no help for Austria-Hungary and Italy's eyes, and what is far more important to the great power that is Italy at this time is unification. Now a budding colonial power with territories in Africa, Italy might see a potential avenue to squeeze in some space between them and their colonial territory of Eritrea, or perhaps even take hold of the Ottoman territory in North Africa. The young Italians have already largely influenced the budding Young Turks movement in the Ottoman Empire, and, if they have the chance, Italy stands to gain much more from this conflict. Nominally, this means that Austria-Hungary has little choice but to join Italy and Britain to protect themselves against the now monolithic powerhouse that is the Ottoman Russian-German faction. Spain, so far as we could tell, would be otherwise completely indifferent over all this. But what about America, we hear you ask? Well, it's complicated. America had annexed the Hawaiian Kingdom just 2 years earlier and feared that the Japanese Empire would do the same before they could. King Kalakaua had tried to put Hawaii under the protection of the Japanese Empire rather than the USA, and Hawaii already had a large ethnic Japanese presence and protested American annexation to no avail. That being said, Japan's alternative to America taking the Philippines was Germany, and Japan explicitly preferred the USA taking those islands from Spain over Germany. And one of Theodore Roosevelt's #1 priorities during his future presidency was keeping good relations with Japan and cementing cooperative ties between the two nations. He was actually quite the weeb for the time, so far as we can tell. He personally mediated the Treaty of Portsmouth at the end of the Russo-Japanese War, which he would later be given the Nobel Peace Prize for. He gave the Japanese advice throughout the entire affair, forming a strong connection with the chief ambassador Jutaro Komura, and maintaining a major interest in Japanese culture. He would go on to gain a small obsession with Bushido and other Japanese cultural philosophies, likening them to the America's mythical cowboy spirit. Now, this wouldn't come to be for another year at least, but suffice to say that the American spirit to cooperate with Japan was already there. For the sake of this scenario, we'll say that America nominally takes the side of Japan and Britain until the assassination of President McKinley. In a weird addition, the Dutch. Wilhelmina of Orange-Nassau is presently the Queen of the Netherlands, and she hates what's going on in the Boer Wars. She sends the Gelderland down to evacuate the South African Republic's president, but after it drops off Kruger, it collides with the British ship Peterson, just like in our timeline. However, after dropping off Kruger in Marseille, in this scenario, the Gelderland picks up war materials for the Dutch East Indies. We'll say guns and ammo. So when it collides with the Peterson, it explodes, and that spins out of control into a diplomatic nightmare. Hating Britain and now seeking revenge for the loss of the Gelderland, Wilhelmina turns to the Ottoman alliance to attack Britain, dragging Britain officially into the war after the destruction of the Gelderland and Peterson. So the powers are largely set. We have the British Empire, Japan, Italy, Austria-Hungary, and later America, with Portugal on the side since they fought alongside Britain in our timeline's World War I, against Germany, Russia, France, the Ottoman Empire, and later the Netherlands. World War I won't officially begin for a bit, however, as it will take some time for Japan's navy to mount up and answer to the Ottoman threat, and it will take the Russians some time to try to burst out onto the scene to attack Japan, who will, of course, end up attacking bits of their rear end. And it will take a bit of time for the Netherlands and Britain to go south, and it will take a bit of time until the presidency of Roosevelt to get America into the war. So this will start with a slow burn. Simply put, we start with Emperor Meiji on New Year's Day, 1900, declaring himself as having received revelation from Amaterasu herself that she is the wife of Allah, the one true God, and indeed that he claims genetic right as the direct descendant of the one and only God of Abraham to the leadership of Islam. And indeed that the Islam of the Middle East is not right, and this new Meiji version of Islam is the true will of Allah. Getting completely incensed by this mastercraft and trollsmanship, Abdul Hamid II declares war on Japan despite the fact that he will never be able to project so far in a good time. Germany, rolling their eyes at this, agrees to go along with things because Germany is pretty heckin' strong right now, and they just agreed to the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, among several other good intentions between the two nations. Russia publicly shows support for this action, as Japan was already rumoring about how great it would be if they could just take some continental territory, and this leads Japan to declare war on Russia in a reactionary tactic, bringing the Russo-Japanese War on 4 years early. Russia now calls upon their at-the-time ally in the form of France. Somebody attacked Russia, so now France is honor-bound to deliver upon their promise to help. So now we have France, Russia, Germany, and the Ottomans against Japan. This seems like a pretty one-sided affair, certainly, until you remember that Japan is literally on the other side of the world, and the only one with a land route there seizes Russia, and it's the dead of winter. So realistically, the beginning of this war is going to be a slow burn where Japan will seek assistance from America and Britain, while Austria-Hungary will look really dubious as they're surrounded on all sides by people who share the Russian sentiment that Austria-Hungary really shouldn't be a thing. After having been snubbed by Russia recently in the denial of Bosnia and Herzegovina to Austria-Hungary. And while the Triple Alliance is technically on right now, Germany is not exactly living up to their deal with the support of Russia's assholery. So Austria-Hungary is considering getting cozy with the Japanese side of things, because Russia and the Ottomans, if they gain power from this war, will ultimately make the decision to gobble Austria-Hungary right up, and that's a very obvious conclusion to them. And let's talk about Italy. Historically, Italy was only a few decades old at that point as a unified central nation, rather than as an old-school kingdom, and it was eager to flex its muscles as a budding colonial power with territories like Eritrea and Africa. They would go on eventually to commit the War of Libya against the Ottomans and that North African territory. Well, were the Ottomans really doing anything good with it? Wouldn't it be better if Italy just exercised a bit of sympathy to these Japanese who rightfully changed their religion, and now the Ottomans were going power mad over it? Taking the opportunity, Italy is the first major European power to simply agree to Japan's side, vowing to defend the Japanese from Ottoman territory, and gain a lot of clout and land in the process. That's right. Of all the powers that will be in this fight, Italy is the one that ends up being the first to join against the Ottomans out of sheer opportunism, and Austria-Hungary will end up using this as an excuse to split the Triple Alliance and break ways with Germany to join Italy. Serbia and Romania, of course, have no love of the Ottomans and are not going to idly stand by and let the Ottomans march through their land, so they'll inevitably be dragged into this fight, but let's talk about that next time. President McKinley of the USA is sympathetic, but is not willing to dedicate American soldiers to the war effort, instead providing military relief and staying out for now while Britain, tied up already in the Boer Wars, minds their own business for a while. That all being said, Japan is still more than welcome to access American ports and shipyards to bolster their growing modern navy. McKinley, of course, is not so hesitant to support the Japanese that their money is no longer any good to the American economy. And with that, the combatants are in place and the stage is set. Having decided to pull the ultimate thread to unravel the last absolute ruler of the Ottoman Empire, Meiji has unwittingly started World War I 14 and a half years early. If he plays his cards right, he could completely upend the entire status quo of the Middle East, score impressive land gains in the eastern Russia, and position his nation at the center of the world stage for decades to come, while single-handedly redrawing the map for one of the world's largest and most influential regions. If he doesn't, however, Japan will be completely annihilated under the force of numerous world powers, while their distant and unrelated allies, having only come into this out of opportunism or bald necessity, will make out of the conflict what they can, before diplomatically stepping out of the limelight and leaving Meiji's budding superpower to fight itself out and be ultimately extinguished by other, more experienced nations. If this scenario gets over 100 likes, we'll promptly go to the next episode of the series. If not, we'll just chug on with something new. Thanks for coming. We hope your day is absolutely unreal, and please do consider going on over to our Patreon, because making alternate history videos is a time-consuming process, and, we're poor. So, thanks a bunch, everybody. Stay safe, stay inside, stay healthy, and of course, remember to help each other. Bye!